Hey everybody. Continuing our conversation on microphones, we're going to talk specifically about techniques. So we talked about, some of the specifics about, um, the characteristics of a microphone, and we put to the test a little bit in some hands-on demonstrations about, what the results might be with certain things. But there's some more advanced techniques that I think are worth exploring a little bit. And the first part of that conversation is about intention. What are you planning on doing? What are you recording? What is the genre? Is it music? What genre of music does it belong to? Are you trying to capture um, as clean a sound as possible, or do you want to couple the instrument or sound source with the acoustic space? Those kind of things. So some of the short list of things that I'm thinking about when making decisions about microphones and technique is going to be: are we doing something in a live situation, or is this a studio recording? That's immediately going to change my opinion on some things, right? I'm going to decide whether or not I'm going to use a dynamic microphone instead of a condenser microphone, for example. It would also change some of my uh, decisions regarding placement of microphones or placement of musicians, right? So these kind of things really come into play, and you can, generally speaking, what you're getting yourself into in advance, so you can make some of these decisions, you know, prior to the actual recording session. Do I need to eliminate noise? Now that might come as a consequence of live or in the studio. If I'm in the studio, maybe I'm it's easier for me to isolate the musician or the particular sound source or something like that. But if I'm live, do I have to consider placement or baffling sounds, or using these dividers and everything to sort of separate sound sources so there's less bleed from microphone to microphone and less chance of a phasing type of issue that really might detract from the overall quality of the recording? What are the sound sources that we're going to be recording? Right? So is this instrument? Is it the voice? Um, is it an electric instrument that might be direct input, or we have to put a microphone in front of an amplifier? How is that going to change our decision making process? What about a piano versus a trumpet? Um, all sorts of considerations that need to be made and would affect our decision making. So what are we intending to do? What are we intending to record? And what is the best situation or best scenario for that, or best equipment setup? But also, when might we want to go against the grain a little bit for maybe a creative purpose? Also, how sensitive does the microphone need to be, or how sensitive is the circumstance even? Do you actually want an accurate recording of something, or are you going for a dirty, gritty, distorted, low fidelity sort of sound? Um, Certain genres of music might lend itself directly to that sort of thing. And how can we get out of the box a little bit and make things a little bit interesting? A lot of the microphone techniques that we're going to talk about here were developed and um, sort of founded by accidental awesomeness, mistakes, right? People doing things that have never been done before. So how can we do creative things to possibly come up with the new cool technique that everybody's going to be using in pop music for the next 10 years, right? That stuff doesn't happen unless you try something different. Okay, so let's talk about the microphone transducer. So a little bit of review here, just to remind you of the different types of microphones we've got, right? Condenser microphone um, that requires a 48-volt phantom power, that is going to be more for a studio application, that is much more sensitive than other microphones. So important to remember about that extra power that's necessary, how sensitive they are, how fragile they can be, right? Dynamic microphones, which are lend themselves better to a live performance, that are a little less sensitive and maybe more rugged and can stand some abuse, but also require a lot of gain and require to be closer to a sound source. And then finally, again, we almost treat it like it's its own type of microphone, and I guess in a way it sort of is, but it's ribbon microphones can really be considered a type of dynamic microphone. Um, but it does have a small piece of aluminum foil in it, and it is even much more fragile than a condenser microphone, even though it's really a dynamic microphone. So this is sort of like one of those exceptions to the rule. But when might we want to use any one of these types of microphones? We just need to be aware of it, right? And then a little bit of review on polarity, or the directionality of sound, right? So your three basic types: cardioid, which is the heart-shaped, picking up from the front; um, bidirectional, which is the figure eight pattern, so equally sensitive from the front and the back; and then omnidirectional, sensitive from all directions. When might we want to use one of these? What circumstance lends itself best to one or the other? And is there any combination of these that we can use for some sort of creative purpose? And we're going to explore that just a little bit more. So we know that placement matters. We heard the difference when we pointed the exact same microphone at the same distance from a sound source, but in a different position. So you have to consider the instrument itself and what the position of the microphone is going to do to the color of the sound. Then you have to think about, well, the distance from the instrument itself. I might have a little bit more boomy, low frequency sound if I'm too close to the body of that acoustic guitar. But I might like that resonant, fuller sound that I get, but to get rid of some of the boominess, maybe I just need to back off the proximity to the sound source. What about wanting to record the acoustic space? So a lot of times in a recording studio application, you're in a dead environment, right? It's not the room itself is designed to break up sound, right? So that it does not reflect off the walls and bounce around and cause a bunch of reverberation and stuff. We want that to be a dry environment. But there are certain circumstances where maybe you're going to record this classically trained piano concerto type thing, and you want to get the sound captured from this beautiful performance hall that the grand piano sits in. So you wouldn't necessarily want to have the microphone right up next to the piano strings. I mean, that might give you a high quality recording and would be better suited for the controlled environment of a studio space. But in order to make the most out of that beautiful acoustic environment that you're in, you'd want to back those microphones out. So in addition to a high quality recording of the piano, the instrument itself, you're getting the sound of how the room, the acoustic space, reacts to that instrument. And finally, the issue about phasing. Whether or not, you could have 20 microphones on a single instrument, and you would, like, the natural assumption would be that that's going to, be a very superior recording because you have all these different, placements, and you can make a little mix out of all those different microphones and make it sound great. But it's not going to do you any good if you have phasing issues because of the different proximities of all those microphones reaching the sound source. So here's a brief video. I know we talked a little bit about it, but here's a brief video that sort of, I like it because it illustrates very clearly sort of what happens with phasing issues. Let's take a look.
A membership to lynda.com.
All right, well, I'm not trying to sell you on Linda, but I like that example. It sort of illustrates things pretty well, and that 3-to-1 rule is an important one to remember, just to upfront eliminate the potential for those phasing issues. So let's go into some diagrams and some analysis of different sorts of technique with microphone. Now, we talked about some of the basic stuff about the microphone itself and things about positioning, but when I talk about technique, I'm really talking about this combination of microphone techniques. So the difference between a mono recording and a stereo microphone technique, we explored this a little bit, and we understand the difference, right, between mono and stereo. Mono is going to make the perception is going to be that the sound is coming out of both your left and right speakers equally powerful. Whereas the stereo recording, you could have different things, different frequency ranges, and different amplitudes coming out of the left and right speakers. So different characteristics for a particular instrument too. And that can be useful. And it could also be detrimental if you do it unintentionally. And then there's also sometimes we have to think about surround sound recordings, right, for post-production or for other things. We mentioned using um, well, surround sound techniques for things like live recordings where you would want to hear a crowd all around you. And sometimes, musicians will release their albums in a surround sound mix and things. So you have to have recordings that are surround sound capable in order to be able to go back and do that sort of thing. So let's look at stereo microphone techniques because it's more than just setting up two microphones. There's some specific things that we can do with it, and we need to understand the intentions behind them and a little bit of the description so we know what it looks like when we say these different stereo mic techniques. So the most basic one is called the spaced pair, or you might hear it referred to as AB. So just left and right microphones on a single sound source that are at least a foot apart. The most important things here is that they're identical types, so generally two cardioid microphones that are pointed at the same sound source. Um, they're parallel to each other, and they're pointed both towards the sound source. And it's different to differentiate that the parallel part is important for the spaced pair because if you start to angle the microphones at all, then you're not really doing a spaced pair at all. And part of the point of doing this, instead of doing, this is like the most basic stereo technique you can use. So if you wanted to take a mono recording and be like, yeah, you know what, let's spice this up a little bit and go stereo. This might be the first step that you would take is to make a spaced pair recording. And the reason why is that we're increasing the stereo width, right? We're taking the perceived sound from the middle of that phantom third speaker, right? And we're spreading that left and right as far as we can in the mix so we can have control over that. And that immediately gives us not only width in whatever sound we're recording, but space for other things in the mix. So those are important characteristics of what we're doing here. The next stereo technique is called an XY technique, and that's where there's this crossover. So two identical cardioid microphones that you're going to be using for this, but they meet at the front of the microphone where they're sensitive to sound, they meet at a 90-degree angle. And sometimes you'll see them meeting just like you do right there, or sometimes they'll be the very front of the capsule there where the sensitive to the sound will be stacked right on top of each other. But the idea is that they meet perfectly at this 90-degree angle. And what does that mean, really? Well, it's going to increase your stereo width again, but it's going to be a little bit sharper of a crossover than that spaced pair, right? Because we're going to get, it also means that your right becomes your left because of the directionality of that cardioid mic sensitivity. And, this is pretty common to see. But it's slightly different than the next, which is an ORTF technique. And it's still, again, two identical cardioid microphones, but instead of pointing towards each other and coming together at that 90-degree angle, they're pointed away from each other at a 110-degree angle. And it's not going to, the microphones are not going to blow up and you're not going to have the worst recording ever if this is 111 degrees. But there's some specifics here about the angle and about the distance apart from the sensitive areas of the microphone, 7 inches. 7 inches is generally perceived to be the distance if you went straight through your head from ear to ear. So what we're trying to do here is accurately mimic the human hearing, right? So your ears don't point towards each other at a 90-degree angle. That's just not natural, right? So this is a little bit more of a natural style recording, what your ears would really pick up when you're hearing things. And that also lends itself to different placement because you wouldn't necessarily use an ORTF technique right in front of a sound source. This would be more of a stereo technique that would be used to capture some more of that acoustic space. you're going to back it off of the instrument, the proximity is going to be a little bit further away from the sound source, and it's going to, maybe be a little less sensitive to the sound source itself, but it's also, when you increase the gain, you'll still get a pretty solid recording, but it'll more accurately reflect how humans hear things, and will also pick up more of the acoustic space sound. So ORTF, definitely different stereo technique, but important to understand why the pointing the other direction and the specifics about the angle and the distance between the microphones. Okay, just a couple more. The Bloom line technique is similar to the XY technique, but it's with two bidirectional microphones. So you're really creating this very, very broad, wide sound, right? Because you're collecting sounds from 4 different angles. So 2 bidirectional microphones placed at 90-degree angles of each other, giving you essentially 4 different directions that you're capturing sound from. So that can be extremely useful underneath like a piano, a grand piano with a lid up or something like that, because you're going to be getting the sound of the strings and also how it reflects off of the top of the piano lid and then where it bounces around from there. So they've got to be stacked really close to each other. Some people feel like when they're first putting these sorts of things together, they're so scared, maybe you're intimidated by having expensive microphones near each other. But that's okay. Yep, that's okay. So this is going to give you a really, really fat stereo image. I mean, fat is a good thing to be said there. It's going to give you this very full sound, and it's going to represent all the different reflections that occur from the sound source. And finally, if there was going to be like the cool kid stereo microphone technique, it would be MidSide. This is sort of like, I don't know, I'm probably dating myself by saying this, but it would be like a hipster stereo technique, right? Like the cool kids do this. All right, so a combination of a cardioid microphone and a bidirectional microphone, right? And if you look at the picture there, we've used these microphones before. So on the top there, pointed to the left is a cardioid microphone. So you have to pretend like the sound source is left of the picture. And we've seen this AKG 414 with the gold plate there, but you notice that it's pointed, like the front of the microphone is actually pointed at us, the viewer, not the sound source, which we're assuming is to the left. So that, and it's set to a bidirectional polarity, so that's picking up sides, the sound of the side of the instrument. So the cardioid is directed at the sound source, and the bidirectional is directed at the sounds coming from the sides of that instrument. And what you're able to do is mix those two things together, and it requires a little bit of post-production actually. So you have to take, you saw me inverting phase, right? So we duplicate, we're going to have 2 recordings, a middle recording and a side recording, and we duplicate the sides, invert the phase, pan them hard left and right, and mix them in with the mono audio recording. So essentially here you have a mono audio recording and a phony stereo recording of the sides. And if you mix those two things together, it's this beautiful, full, wide audio magic that happens. So this has become very popular, and again, like I said, it's sort of like the cool kids stereo mic technique. So just to finish this up, let's listen to some examples of all of this. So I've got this YouTube example of an acoustic guitar player playing the same exact pieces, same exact music, but going through the different microphone techniques that we just talked about so you can hear how they sound. Let's take a look. pretty cool, right? Um, I like that because when it goes through those different microphone techniques, you it's almost like you feel it instead of hear it a little bit, and like in your ears it's sort of, it just like you can feel the width move a little bit and it just seems wider, and there's sometimes it closes up, and then of course sometimes the frequency range is a little bit different sort of a response, but cool to see that all together like that. um, Thanks for watching this one, guys. Just a couple more of these lectures to round out things, so I'll see you next time.